Good evening. It's my pleasure to see you again today. And my pleasure is an honor is more to introduce my dear brother and friend and lead child psychiatrist in the region, my dear Dr. Khaled Fadri. Dr. Khaled Fadri is a consultant child psychiatrist, and he is a clinical director of mostly Health Abu Dhabi and Makani. Dr. Khaled has lots of publications and lots of international presentations in the international conferences and regional conferences. And when you speak, just you mentioned Dr. Khaled Qadri, and this is more than enough because he is a very well-known child psychiatrist in the region, and I'm honored to introduce him to you tonight. Please welcome with me, Dr. Khaled.
Thank you very much, Dr. Medhat. It's always a pleasure and an honor to be part of the annual conference. And thank you very much for your kind introduction. I wanted to thank everyone who's tuned in for their commitment to be on at this time of the evening. Without any further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Michelle Kelly. Dr. Kelly is a board certified behavioral analyst doctoral and a chartered psychologist at the Psychological Society in Ireland. Dr. Kelly has a PhD in applied behavioral analysis and is also associate professor in the Counseling, Special Education and Neurosciences Division in the Emirates College of Advanced Education. Most of Dr. Kelly's work has been working with parents and students and behavior analysts in the management of young people with autism and autistic spectrum disorders. So we're very excited to hear what Dr. Kelly has to say.
Good evening, everyone, and I hope you're enjoying your conference. I'm very excited to be here today to start this evening's session. So before I begin, please allow me to introduce myself. My name is Dr. Michelle Kelly. I am a chartered psychologist with the Psychological Society of Ireland. I'm an associate professor at Emirates College for Advanced Education, which has campuses both here in Abu Dhabi and in Ajman in the UAE, where I am also the program coordinator for the Applied Behavior Analysis, or ABA, graduate programs, where we offer a one-year postgraduate diploma in ABA and a two-year Masters of Education in ABA. If any of you are interested to learn more about these programs, my email address is available on the screen now, and I would be happy to take your queries. I'm also a board certified behavior analyst at the doctoral level. So I am a BCBAD, just like my two colleagues who will be presenting in this session also. So just to provide you with an overview of what you can expect in this session, I will be beginning where I will talk about the functional behavior assessment of challenging behavior in individuals with autism. And then my two colleagues will pick up on topics introduced by me. Dr. Sarah Mead-Jaspers will also look at assessment, but she will focus on appropriate behavior in individuals with autism. And then my colleague, Dr. Clodagh Murray, will pick up on the topic of challenging behaviors and will focus on restrictive and repetitive behaviors in autism. And she will analyze such things as when is it okay to intervene and the ethical implications of that. So this promises to be a very interesting presentation. So let's begin. So the objectives of my talk are firstly that at the end of this, you'll be able to outline a functional approach to challenging behaviors in autism, or ASD. You'll be able to describe indirect functional behavior assessment, descriptive functional behavior assessment, and functional analysis. So I'm sure a lot of you this evening are familiar with autism spectrum disorder. It is a developmental disability and it is characterized by deficits in social communication and interaction, as well as the presence of restricted repetitive behaviors, which my colleague Dr. Clodagh will speak more about later on in this evening's session. The current prevalence rate is at about 1 in 54 as per the CDC, and although not listed amongst the diagnostic criteria, there is certainly an increased likelihood of problem behaviours amongst individuals with autism, and these problem behaviours may include self-injury, chronic stereotypy, sleep problems, meltdowns, aggression, etc. So when we look at these challenging behaviours, obviously we want to improve the quality of life of all individuals with autism, and in order to make positive behavior change and make an impact on their daily life, the daily quality of their life, we first need to understand why they exhibit the challenging behavior. We have seen in the research that efforts made to treat challenging behavior without understanding the function or the purpose that it serves for a person can be inefficient, ineffective, and most worryingly harmful to the individual with autism. We must remember that both appropriate behaviors, like Dr. Sarah is going to talk about, and inappropriate behaviors, like in my presentation and Dr. Clodagh's presentation, they all serve a purpose. An individual who shouts, bites, pinches, self-injures, flaps, etc., they do this for a reason. It's functional for them. So as behavior analysts within the science of behavior analysis, when we study behavior, there's two ways we can do this. We can study the form of the behavior and the function of the behavior. So when we analyze the form, we're looking at the topography, how the behavior actually looks. So if we're looking at aggressive behavior, for example, we might want to clarify or operationally define, is it a punch? Is it a slap? Is it a light touch, etc.? So looking at how the actual behavior, the shape or the form or how the behavior looks. So that's the topography of the behavior. When we're looking at the function of behavior, we're looking at the why. Why does this behavior occur? We're looking at the relationship between this target challenging behavior and the individual's environment to try to determine the purpose or the reason for the behavior and the purpose that it serves this individual. So when we're looking at form versus function, it's important to remember two things. The first of which is that two behaviors can have different forms or different topographies, but serve the same function. So if the function is to get your teacher's attention, the form could be appropriately raising your hand, or the form could be inappropriately pulling your peer's hair in order to access that attention. So again, same function, different forms. And then, of course, a behavior can have the same form or topography, but serve different functions. So, for example, if a child engages in shouting behavior, they might be shouting to get someone's attention, or they may be shouting to escape from some aversive activity. So please allow me to introduce you to Dr. Brian Iwata. So he is a very well-respected behavior analyst, and he's one of the founders of functional analysis, which both Dr. Sarah and I will be discussing this evening. On the right-hand side, you will see a QR code. So please, I invite you to lift up your phones and go and open your cameras. I'm sure you're all very familiar with QR codes as we, deal with this COVID-19 pandemic. And this QR code will bring you to a video that's almost 2 hours long, where Dr. Brian Iwata, the expert in functional analysis and functional behavior assessment, he really brings you through a really detailed account of FBA. But first, let me just play a little snippet of this video where he introduces the basic functions of behavior.
Research conducted over maybe the past 20 to 30 years has shown that in large part, most problem behavior is learned. That is, it's acquired as a result of experience with the individual's environment. So for instance, as this slide shows, a great deal of research has indicated that most problem behavior is maintained by fairly straightforward contingencies. For instance, in a number of cases, problem behavior may be maintained by inadvertent social positive reinforcement delivered by parents, teachers, and so forth. In other cases, problem behavior may be maintained by the opposite, and that is social negative reinforcement, that is escape from task demands. And finally, it's possible that problem behavior could be maintained by automatic reinforcement, that is, the behavior produces its own sensory reinforcers. So that's sort of like the general account of the functions of problem behavior, and the purpose of a functional behavioral assessment is to identify which of those is responsible for maintaining problem behavior at this time. Brian?
So just again to summarize what Dr. Brian Iwata just said, the three main functions are that an individual with autism engages in problematic behavior in order to access social positive reinforcement, social negative reinforcement, and automatic reinforcement. So let's kind of break that down now. So looking more specifically at challenging behavior such as screaming, for example, might result in or produce a new condition or event. So screaming might get a parent's attention or a therapist's attention, or they might get something that they want. Sticking with screaming, it might lead or result in avoidance or escape of a condition or event. So if they scream, they might get out of doing something that they don't want to do. And then automatic reinforcement would mean that the screaming behavior results in a change, an increase or decrease in the individual's level of sensory stimulation. In other words, the screaming in and of itself provides sensory reinforcement. So now let's break these down further, and we're going to start with a video. I want you to watch the video and just think about what purpose or what purpose does the behavior serve the child, or what is the function of this behavior? So I'm sure you correctly identified that behavior, the repetitive and restricted behavior, which Dr. Clodagh is going to talk about in her talk, provides some sort of sensory reinforcement. So when we're looking at automatic or sensory reinforcement, again, Dr. Clodagh is going to explain this in a lot more detail, but it can lead to an increase in sensory stimulation or a decrease, or even a combination. So such behaviors are hand flapping, as you saw in that video, body rocking, toe walking, etc. So now let's look at this video to determine what is the function of this challenging behavior. So there is no sound in this video, but this toddler is showing signs that she is enjoying this activity of having the hamper on her head. As you can see, she is laughing, she was smiling. As soon as the laundry hamper is removed from her head, she immediately starts screaming, running away, stomping her feet, and then begins banging her head on the floor. So the question is, what do you think is the function of this challenging behavior? This challenging behavior being a tantrum consisting of screaming, shouting, and banging her head on the floor. So I'm sure a lot of you have said she wants the hamper back, right? She wants the thing that she likes. So what we label this function as is access to tangibles. So this again is that social positive reinforcement, that positive reinforcement that Dr. Brian Iwata referred to. It's where the individual may be provided with access to a preferred activity or object, in this case a laundry hamper, if doing so results in the cessation of the problem behavior. So later on in that video, and I've given the link in my slides, which I'll be happy to share with you at the end of today, as soon as the parent puts the laundry hamper back on the child's head, what do you think happened? She laughs and she smiles, and she shows signs that she is happy again. So in future, this behavior may increase. So this child will learn that, okay, if I scream and shout and bang my head on the floor, I'll get what I want. And really, we need to take into account the impact of language delay in individuals with autism and the power of challenging behaviors in getting what they want, in accessing tangibles, and the purpose that those challenging behaviors serve these individuals.
Hey, look, let's match your pictures.
make me, I'm not doing it, I'm not doing it.
So what do you think was the function of that behavior? It's likely that you're saying she didn't want to do it, she didn't want to do the task, it was aversive to her, so we label that as escape. So this ties back to Dr. Brian Iwata's social negative reinforcement, where the individual is engaging in a challenging behavior to avoid or escape perhaps an aversive interaction with a peer or staff, or to avoid or terminate an activity or task, which was the case in the video that I just showed you. Okay, so now let's look at the next video, and again the question is, what is the function of this behavior?
Go back to the kitchen.
So this video is quite clear that this child is engaging in this flopping and tantruming behavior in order to access attention from, his mom or his dad, even the dog or the camera that are all present in his environment. So this again ties back to Dr. Brian Iwata's social positive reinforcement, where the challenging behavior is reinforced from the reaction that is obtained from the peers or the staff or the family members. And this attention can be, positive attention, like, oh, you poor thing, are you okay? Oh, don't bang your head. Oh, no, there's no need to poke your eye. Or negative, stop that now, don't do that, etc. And really, it's important for us, as clinicians to remember that even the smallest amount of attention, it can really be the slightest of glances, can be enough to reinforce a challenging behavior. So this brings us to the M in STEAM, which is medical. And of course, it's important for us to, when we do have clients or students who are engaging in challenging behaviors, to check that they don't serve a medical purpose, that we always should rule it out and seek medical assistance. And some examples of challenging behaviors we might see in individuals with autism that may have a medical purpose might be if they're hitting their ears or their head, rubbing their eyes excessively, banging their head off surfaces, holding their stomach, complaining of pain, or if there's a sudden change in behavior, it's always best practice to rule out any potential underlying medical issue first before investigating other possible functions of behavior. So in summary, we use STEAM as a handy way to remember these functions of behavior. So we have S for sensory, T for tangibles, E for escape, A for attention, and M for medical. So sensory maps on to Dr. Brian Iwata's automatic reinforcement. Tangibles maps on to social positive reinforcement, as does attention. And then escape maps onto social negative reinforcement. So as I said earlier, the first step towards positive behavior change for any individual with autism is identifying, what is the function of the problem behavior. So we need to assess the why it occurs before we can come up with a plan to change. So how can we assess the causes? How can we obtain information about the purpose that a behavior serves a person? So we can use FBA, which Dr. Sarah is also going to talk about in her presentation. So FBA is functional behavior assessment, and this identifies what is the reinforcer that is maintaining the problem behavior. So now let me introduce you to another very well-known behavior analyst in our field, and his name is Dr. Greg Hanley. And he has a really useful website, and this QR code will bring you to his practical functional assessment website that has really useful resources for you, including a bank of video tutorials. So again, a really great resource for you as clinicians and also for parents. So now let's just look at a video, a snippet of a presentation that Dr. Greg Hanley gave on functional behavior assessment.
I want to make it clear what functional assessment is not. It is not something you can put in your hand. If someone says, here, I've completed a functional assessment, we need to all come to terms with that as a field and saying that's incomplete. That might be a good start, and emphasis on might be. Okay? So functional assessment you can't hold in your hand because it's a process. It's a process with several levels. It involves a lot of highly discriminated technical professional behavior. And that's why I'm glad we're here this morning to talk about much of that behavior. Okay. And what the process obviously is to identify the factors, the variables influencing problem behavior. Just to get on the same page with terms, there's three ways we break up the functional assessment process. One is indirect assessment. The next is descriptive assessment, and finally there's functional analysis. Indirect assessment means we're not looking at the child with the problem behavior, we're asking other people who have witnessed that problem behavior questions about that behavior. They can be open or closed-ended questions. Closed-ended questions, those tools have names like the motivation assessment scale, questions about behavioral function, the FAST. Those are closed-ended usually. We tend to do open-ended assessments, allowing parents to talk. Descriptive assessment, that means we're going to observe the child in context and where they often engage in problem behavior, and we're going to record their behavior as well as its environmental correlates. We might record the antecedents and the consequence of that behavior. We call that descriptive assessment. You'll see as I reflect on the process after I model it for you, we don't do too much in the name of descriptive assessment. Time-consuming process yields correlations that are often spurious. We do a lot of functional analysis. Functional analysis for us simply means there's direct observation of the child with problem behavior in at least two conditions. And one of those conditions is designed to emulate the context in which they're having problem behavior. And the other one, we take away what we think are the causes of problem behavior, and we get what's called a test control analysis. That's the science in behavior analysis. That's what other scientists do. They turn on, off reactions. In our case, we turn on and off behavior through this test control methodology. Okay? So we have indirect assessments, descriptive assessments, and functional analyses. I'm going to describe our particular commitments to the different methods within these three categories as we go forward. I want to make it very clear, though, that the third one, functional analysis, is integral to the success of behavioral intervention. We've had over, right now the last count, and we're strange enough that we do count these things, there's over 1,000 analyses been published. Nothing has been studied more in applied behavior analysis than functional analysis. Okay. We've had over 500 studies publishing functional analysis. When meta-analyses, literature reviews are conducted, they show that treatments are better when the functional assessment process has been committed to. Treatment effects are even better when functional analyses have been conducted.
So just again to take out what Dr. Greg Hanley was just talking about, we have three types of FBA: indirect assessment, descriptive assessment, and functional analysis. And functional analysis is what Dr. Sarah is going to talk about in her presentation. So starting with indirect assessments, as Dr. Greg Hanley said, this gathers information about the problem behavior, what's happening before the behavior, the antecedents, what's happening after the behavior occurs, the consequences, what's happening. And we can gather this information from their caregivers, the teachers, the therapists, or the individual client themselves. Again, it does not involve any direct observation of the behavior, nor does it involve manipulation of the environment. So what are the different types of indirect assessment? There are structured interviews, one of which is Dr. Greg Hanley's open-ended functional assessment interview, and there's a QR code that will bring you to this assessment tool. It is freely available. There's also checklists, rating scales, questionnaires, and typically most of these are close-ended, as Dr. Greg said in his video. One such close-ended, freely available indirect assessment is the FAST. There are others, the QABF, the MAS. The pros of indirect assessments is that they're easy to implement, they're inexpensive, typically freely available, do not require a lot of resources, and do not require a lot of time, and they can help build rapport, which of course is very important with us as behavior analysts and clinicians, with the caregiver or the client themselves. Some cons then is that they may be unreliable and they're less likely to be effective. So then with descriptive assessments, these do include a direct observation of behavior, unlike the indirect assessment, but they do not include a manipulation of the environment. So such descriptive assessments, as Dr. Gregg referred to, can be an analysis of the antecedents, the behavior and the consequence in the environment. Some of the pros are that you do actually see the behavior in person, unlike indirect assessments. They may be easy to implement. You can easily train others in how to use them, and they do not require a lot of resources. Some cons then are that they do not provide a scientific demonstration of the behavior reinforcer relation, and they're less likely to be effective. And they can take a lot of time. Finally, then there's a functional experimental analysis, which again, Dr. Sarah Mead Jaspers will discuss in her presentation. These do include a direct observation like descriptive assessments and unlike indirect assessments. And they do, this is the only type of FBA that does include a manipulation of the environment. So as Dr. Gregg described, it replicates the behavior environment relation. In other words, he was talking about it being the science of behavior analysis, in that we can turn on and off the behavior in those test control conditions. So a graph that may come from a functional analysis will look something like this. And again, the pros of a functional analysis is that it is the most precise form of FBA, it is the most effective too, and it likely will lead to good treatment effects. Some of the cons is that it may temporarily strengthen the behavior as we do turn on and off that challenging behavior. It does require expertise, so we do recommend that a board certified behavior analyst be there to help design and implement the functional analysis. And it does require a lot of time and effort, certainly. So in summary then, how do you conduct a functional behavior assessment? So it can be best viewed as a 4-step process as outlined in Cooper, Heron and Heward. So firstly, with those first 2 types of FBA, you gather your initial information with indirect and descriptive assessments. You then use this information to formulate hypotheses that you can then test within a functional or experimental analysis in step 3. And then your final step is that you develop the intervention options based on the function of problem behavior. Some of the benefits, so if you have strategies that are based upon the results of an FBA, they're more likely to incorporate reinforcement and less likely to incorporate punishment. The effects are more durable. It is most effective in decreasing problem behavior, increasing appropriate behavior, and maintaining positive changes over time. Here are some references and great resources which I'm happy to share with you. So thank you all so much for your kind attention this evening. As I've said, please feel free to email me if you would like some information on our ABA graduate programs at ECAE, and or if you would like a copy of this presentation this evening. So now I'd like to hand you over to Dr. Sarah Mead Jaspers. I hope you all enjoy the rest of your conference. Goodbye.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kelly, for a wonderful talk. I think you highlight a very important point. Often in clinical practice, we will get families who present with wanting to address certain challenging behavior. And a very important point is getting an understanding, as you say, and a function of some of these challenging behaviors, and formulating, having an understanding of the behavior before we move into intervention, because this is what informs the treatment and intervention plan. So thank you very much. Our next speaker, again, gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Sarah Mead Jaspers. Dr. Jaspers started her practice in applied behavior analysis at the New England Center in the States. She then moved to the UAE in 2007 and joined the New England Center in Abu Dhabi. Since then, Dr. Jaspers has gone back to the States to complete her doctoral work and has held many academic positions in multiple universities in the States, and was an adjunct faculty member and the director of a therapeutic day school. In 2020, Dr. Jaspers came back and joined the faculty at the Emirates College of Advanced Education. Her expertise includes working with individuals with autism and their families, and the assessment and treatment of severe challenging behavior. And her talk today is an evaluation of a function analysis of appropriate behavior with adolescents with autism spectrum disorders. So over to you, Dr. Jaspers.
Good evening, everyone. I appreciate you being here with us tonight. I want to give a thank you to Dr. Michelle Kelly for getting our time started with such a comprehensive overview of challenging behavior in autism spectrum disorder. Her introduction to the topic really makes my job easy here to pick up with a specific example of how an assessment can be used to inform intervention in this population. I'd like to begin my time by thanking the event coordinator and her colleagues here at the Abu Dhabi International Mental Health Conference for the opportunity to speak here today. Today has been filled with many interesting presentations and discussions, and I look forward to continuing to learn from and network with other presenters and attendees. I have two brief notes before we get started. First, the QR code on the bottom left of your screen, that will take you to a list of sources I will be citing today. If you're interested in viewing this complete list, just open your smartphone's camera and focus on the QR code. After a few seconds of focusing, a link to a Google Doc should appear, and that's where you can find my reference list. Second, a perk of the virtual platform is that it makes it quite simple for the audience to ask questions. So I would encourage you to enter any questions you may have into the chat. I will answer as I can, and I hope to be able to have some engaging and real-time interactions with many of you. My plan for our time is to open with a discussion of the intersection of research and clinical practice in applied behavior analysis. Then I will turn to a clinical research in the assessment and treatment of severe behavior, and we'll take you through a recent study conducted by my lab in one of our clinical sites. Another note I'd like to make, I know we have folks with varying backgrounds in the room. I want to try to speak to all of you. So fellow board certified behavior analysts or staff in applied behavior analysis programs, there may be times when I'm covering content that you learn back in, ABA 101 using less than technical language. I hope you'll be willing to let me show you how I talk about our science to other folks in other specialties. For those of you who do not have much training in ABA, please don't worry, I'm speaking to you as well, though there may be times when I get into some technical details. I hope you'll be okay with me taking a few deep dives into my research and know that I'll pull back out the technicalities to discuss the big picture before too long. Now, on to a discussion of the intersection of research and practice in applied behavior analysis. In the late 1940s, 1950s, some psychologists began testing various behavioral principles with humans that up until that point had only been used with non-human animals. The idea was that the science of behavior was a powerful tool that could be harnessed to alleviate human suffering, teach new skills, eradicate problematic behavior, and so forth. In 1968, our field officially was born as the first issue of the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis was published, and Baer, Wolf, and Risley published their seminal paper that defined what applied behavior analysis was. A contemporary definition has strayed not far from its roots. The science in which tactics derived from the principles of behavior are applied systematically to improve socially significant behavior, and experimentation is used to identify the variables responsible for behavior change. We use the principles of behavior to address socially significant behavior by experimentally determining the variables responsible for that behavior change. It really is as cool as it sounds. We get to work at the intersection of research and clinical work every single day. So that's where I'll head next. Let's take a little walk through some of the similarities between researchers and clinicians in ABA. Let's start with the question of what. So what do researchers in ABA do? Well, we determine the effects of some sort of independent variable on a dependent variable. Now, what do clinicians do? They determine the effects of an intervention on a target behavior. Said another way, they also determine the effects of an independent variable on a dependent variable. So you can see the what do we do, very similar. Now, how do we do it? How do researchers in ABA determine the effects of an IV on a DV? Historically and typically, we use single subject research designs with each subject serving as his or her own control, so we truly can see the effects within that single person of a certain intervention. How do clinicians in ABA determine the effects of an intervention on target behavior? Exact same way. We use single subject research designs. We look at baseline responding compared to responding with the intervention in place to confirm whether or not our intervention is effective. Next question, why do researchers in ABA do what they do? Well, we're looking to identify the best ways to address behavioral excesses and deficits. We're hoping to disseminate our findings to improve practice worldwide. Why do clinicians in ABA do what they do? Again, we're looking here more locally, but to identify the best ways to address behavioral excesses and deficits, and really to improve the quality of life of the clients that we see on a daily basis. So as you can see, the intersection related to what and how and why is very similar, whether we're doing research or we're doing clinical work. That's why the scientist practitioner model really embodies the work that we do in applied behavior analysis. Our research informs our practice, and our practice informs our research. Both really should inform policy, but that's a totally another talk for another day. Clinical questions that we have, they're addressed with the same rigor and methodology that research questions are addressed. And finally, we aim to ask research questions that have clinical utility. So I have an example of the scientist practitioner model in action in ABA to share with you, and that is functional analysis methodology. So let's start back at the original question. In the late 1970s, there was a clinical question, and that was, how do I figure out why this problem behavior is happening? We'll talk about what problem behavior is in just a moment. And there was a research response, and that was the development of functional analysis methodology to answer that clinical question. So let's dive into this. We'll start by making sure we're on the same page about some terminology. When I'm talking about problem behavior, this is also known as challenging behavior, maladaptive behavior, severe behavior. In general, a socially important behavior targeted for improvement. Often this is a behavioral excess that interferes with skill acquisition, interaction with the community, or the health and safety of that person or others. You can see some examples down there on the bottom. I'll probably use problem behavior just because it's short to abbreviate here in the slides. As you heard from Dr. Michelle Kelly, there are many learned functions of problem behavior. Just like adaptive behavior, it's learned, it serves some sort of function. So we might see that, people are engaging in problem behavior to access positive reinforcement in the form of accessing attention or access to materials or activities, or they may be working towards some negative reinforcement. They're engaging in problem behavior to escape from something they don't want to be doing. Just like Dr. Kelly walked you through, all of our problem behavior has some sort of reinforcement component linked to it. So our goals of functional analysis methodology immediately is to identify those maintaining variables, the source of reinforcement for that problem behavior. And ultimately, we want to use that information about the variable to design an effective function-based treatment that results in a decrease in problem behavior for that person. So until the 1980s, indirect and descriptive assessments were the primary assessments used in practice. With the publication of this article, Toward a Functional Analysis of Self-Injury in 1982, Dr. Iwata and colleagues changed the approach to the assessment and treatment of severe problem behavior. They developed what they call the functional analysis. So this is an experimental model to identify the cause and effect relations between the environment and problem behavior. It involves systematic exposure to controlled assessment conditions. The analogy we often use is that it's the allergy test of behavior. So in an allergy test, you are exposing someone to very controlled amounts of a potential allergen. You're seeing what flares up. We do the same thing with behavior. We expose people to a very controlled amount of a potentially, a situation where problem behavior might occur, and we see where problem behavior flares up in the same way. So I'll talk you through the details of that next. So the general procedure, the standard methodology from the early 80s, was to compare levels of problem behavior observed during test and control conditions. During our test conditions, we present a potentially aversive stimulus, and we deliver a potential reinforcer contingent on problem behavior. I'll give you some specific examples in the next slide. And then we have a control condition in which we present all potential reinforcers continuously. So ideally, there's no quote unquote reason for someone to engage in problem behavior in that condition. And we repeat the exposures to each condition and continue until differential responding is observed. So let's talk about the specific conditions. In a typical functional analysis, we'll usually see a test condition for attention, the test for social positive reinforcement. So in this condition, there's going to be very low levels of attention. Then contingent on problem behavior, attention will be delivered. In the demand condition, a test for social negative reinforcement. Here, there typically will be work required of the individual. We'll ask them to do various tasks. Contingent on problem behavior, we remove that. We allow them to escape the tasks. And then when we're testing for automatic reinforcement, typically that person is alone or having no interaction with someone else. We want to see if problem behavior will persist in the absence of any social interaction. We compare responding in all of those conditions to a control condition, a play condition, in which there's no program demands, non-contingent attention, really no reason, speaking loosely, for problem behavior to occur. However, any variable can be tested. So as long as you have a test condition in which that variable is delivered contingent on problem behavior and a control condition in which the variable is delivered non-contingently, you're doing a functional analysis at that point. So let's look at a graph. So these are data for his pseudonym, not his real name, is Josh. And we're looking at aggression, and we're measuring responses per minute of aggression during 10-minute sessions. So on the black circle data path, this is our no interaction condition, our test for automatic reinforcement. So in that one, Josh and the behavior analyst sitting in the room together, nothing going on. We see very low levels of aggression. After 10 minutes, we switch. Now we run a 10-minute session of our attention condition. This is graphed on the red square data path. Here, if Josh were to engage in problem behavior, we would say, hey buddy, don't do that. If you need something, you can use your words or deliver some sort of attention like that. Then 10 minutes later, we switched to a play condition. Here he had access to toys, we chatted with him, we were close by, he didn't want for anything. So that's graphed on the green circle data path. And finally, we tested a demand condition. Here we were asking him to do simple tasks, kind of simple academic things like write your name or show me where your nose is. In this condition, if he were to engage in aggression, we'd say, whoa, okay, you don't have to. I guess you can just take a break. And we continue cycling through 10-minute exposures to these different types of situations until we start to see differential levels of problem behavior occurring. That occurred very quickly with Josh. We could very easily see that the highest levels of aggression were occurring when attention was being delivered contingent on his aggression. So what that tells us that Josh's aggression was maintained by access to adult attention, and now we know how to intervene effectively. So we could, for example, give Josh lots of attention all the time. Non-contingent reinforcement would be the technical term here. If he has it, he shouldn't need to engage in aggression to get it. We could minimize the amount of attention after aggression. The technical term here would be extinction. We would make sure that we're not reinforcing aggression. Likely what most of us would do is try to teach Josh a safer and more socially acceptable way to ask for attention. Technical term here is differential reinforcement. So if we can teach him to say, excuse me, or play with me, that would be much better than engaging in aggression. So that leads us to today's big question, because I was talking about the scientist practitioner model, right? So the big question is, are these clinical data or are these research data? I'll give you a moment before I give you the answer. Think about it. What do you think? The answer, a little bit of a trick question, both. So Josh was referred for the assessment and treatment of aggression to our clinic. At that time, I was accepting participants into my dissertation study. So this FA data set was included in my dissertation, so research, and also was used to develop an effective intervention for Josh to decrease his aggression. So if we return back to the scientist practitioner model in action in applied behavior analysis, we see this clinical question from the late 1970s. How do we figure out why problem behavior is happening? We saw the research response, the functional analysis methodology, and then we see our clinical follow-up. Now this is what we do. FA methodology is now best practice. It's the hallmark of behavioral assessment. And so many questions clinically and research-wise have been asked about how we refine FA methodology to address a whole slew of other questions. So at this point, I will turn to a contemporary clinical research in the assessment and treatment of problem behavior, specifically an example from my research lab. So I'm going to describe an evaluation of a functional analysis of appropriate behavior. This study was conducted by one of my graduate students, Heather Hancock, as her capstone project in her master's program. So this is a study that truly was born out of a clinical context. As context, Heather and her colleagues were receiving many referrals for the assessment and treatment of problem behavior from the staff of the group homes at a residential facility. And this seemed pretty odd to us because minimal problem behavior seemed to occur when Heather and other members of the behavior team were in the house. Based on anecdotal observations, many of the youth who were being referred could and would make appropriate requests for a variety of reinforcers. And that led us to wonder if, for whatever reason, maybe these requests were not being honored when the behavior team was not in the home. So we started thinking about a clinical question. We started wondering how we could know for any given client if we needed to teach the client an appropriate request, like I talked about before, or if we need to teach the staff how to respond to an appropriate request. So this clinical question led to our research response, a functional analysis of appropriate requests that had never been done before. So I just spent some time talking about how the assessment and treatment of problem behavior has evolved into this well-established two-phase strategy in ABA. During the assessment phase, a functional analysis is used to determine the current determinants of problem behavior, and subsequently a function-based treatment such as non-contingent reinforcement, extinction, or differential reinforcement is implemented. Now, to some degree, this is based on the assumption that there's a skill deficit and the client should be the focus of the intervention. We need to teach that person how to ask for what they want. Now we have a plot twist, though. What if we conduct a functional analysis to identify the function of problem behavior and start teaching an appropriate request, only to find out that that client already has the request in their repertoire? The treatment options begin to look a little bit different. Potentially, we need caregiver training about how to respond to requests, or maybe we need to teach tolerance to delays and denials of requests, or maybe we need to teach other requests that are better suited for that environment. So we start wondering, can we develop an efficient way to identify the function of problem behavior and determine if the client has any appropriate requests that serve the same function? More specifically, we start thinking, what would happen if we put contingencies on problem behavior and appropriate requests during a functional analysis? And that sounded like an empirical question. So our purpose was to evaluate a functional analysis protocol for appropriate requests. We had 3 participants, 3 males aged 17 to 19 years old. They all were diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. They all had a history of engaging in problem behavior, and they could emit and respond to vocal verbal behavior or signs, so they could communicate with us. We conducted this study in a residential facility serving children and adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and we conduct the sessions right there in a therapy room at the facility. All of our sessions were 5 minutes in length. We conducted multiple sessions per day, 2 to 4 days per week, and each condition utilized a dedicated therapist as well as an assistant. Our materials were pretty simple. They included a table and a chair for the subject and the therapist, a video camera, timer, and mobile phones with a county app to collect data. Additional subject and condition-specific materials also were included. I'll come to those a little bit later. So here, if you're a visual person, here's a little image of what it looked like. We have Heather there on the right in the yellow t-shirt. One of our participants is there on the left, and they're getting ready to start one of their sessions together. Before we actually started the experimental phase, though, we conducted 2 assessments. We conducted a paired stimulus preference assessment to identify highly preferred items for use in some conditions. And we also conducted an indirect assessment, a functional analysis screening tool to identify variables likely to maintain problem behavior, to determine if a test for a tangible function should be included, and to design safe functional analysis procedures. Our first dependent variable was problem behavior that was defined individually. For Emmett, again, these are all pseudonyms, it was property destruction and loud vocalizations. For Todd, self-injurious behavior and vocal stereotypy. For Logan, aggression, property destruction, and vocalizations. We collected data as the frequency and then reported it as the number of occurrences per session. Appropriate requests were our second dependent variable. These appropriate requests were defined individually according to the condition, which I'll talk about next, and we also collected them as frequency data. So for Emmett and Todd in the attention condition, their appropriate requests were saying the experimenter's name or asking a question. In the demand condition, it was saying all done or break. In the tangible condition, it was saying the name of the item, specifically Skittles or Doritos. And in the play condition, it was any of the requests from other conditions. Logan was very similar, but he communicated primarily with signs, so we also allowed appropriate signs as appropriate requests for him. Our general procedure was based on standard FA methodology that I just walked through. We added a test for maintenance by social positive reinforcement in the form of access to a preferred item. And we delivered the condition-specific consequence contingent on the occurrence of problem behavior or an appropriate request. In the attention condition, that was our test for maintenance by social positive reinforcement. Here, the therapist pretended to engage in work and contingent on problem behavior or appropriate requests, delivered brief verbal and physical attention. All other behaviors, as you'll see for all of the other conditions, had no programmed consequences. In the tangible condition, therapists delivered brief pre-session access to a tangible item and then withheld access. Contingent on problem behavior or an appropriate request, that was the delivery of one piece of that tangible item. In the demand condition, here is a test for maintenance by social negative reinforcement. Therapist delivered a new work instruction every 15 seconds, and contingent on problem behavior or an appropriate request, they were granted a brief escape from work. In our play condition, this served as our control for other test conditions. Therapists delivered non-contingent attention and access to tangible items, and no work instructions were given. We used a multi-element design with all subjects, and sessions were continued until stable and differentiated responding occurred, just like you saw at the beginning of this presentation. Here are our results for Emmett. We're looking at the frequency of appropriate requests and problem behavior on the y-axis across sessions. For Emmett, we saw very low levels of problem behavior across all conditions, and we saw very high levels of appropriate requests in the attention condition. For Logan, very similar data, just a different condition. So we saw low levels of problem behavior across all conditions, very high levels of appropriate requests in the tangible condition. Todd had a little bit of a different pattern of responding. Here we saw very low levels of appropriate requests and higher levels of problem behavior during the tangible condition and the attention condition. So let's talk about what those mean instead of just the raw data. There was one pattern that Emmett and Logan showed. That was higher requests in certain test conditions, very low levels of problem behavior across all conditions. Here, we can use a function-based intervention that could build on those appropriate requests, such as teaching staff to deliver the reinforcers, or teaching weighting, teaching denial tolerance, teaching a variety of appropriate requests. Second pattern was emitted by Todd. Here we saw higher levels of problem behavior and very low levels of appropriate requests. So for him, his function-based intervention probably needs to involve the teaching of appropriate requests. So we do have some limitations and exciting ideas for future research. In this study, both the problem behavior and appropriate request were reinforced. So that leads us to wonder what would happen if we then stopped reinforcing appropriate requests. Would we see problem behavior emerge for the two that did not previously demonstrate any problem behavior in the assessment? Also leads us to a question of how often do appropriate requests occur in standard functional analyses that deliver consequences for only problem behavior. And finally, this study focused only on assessment. So the next obvious follow-up question is, does this approach lead to more effective or efficient interventions? So if we return to the scientist practitioner model in action, our clinical question was, how do we know if we need to teach the client an appropriate request, or if we need to teach the staff how to respond to an appropriate request? And our research response was a functional analysis of appropriate requests. Our clinical follow-up is that potentially during initial assessments, we may now want to start considering reinforcing or at least collecting data on appropriate requests when assessing problem behavior. We'll probably see how that goes and ask more questions. So to wrap up, we've walked through a very large and a very specific contemporary example of the scientist practitioner model in applied behavior analysis and severe behavior, and hopefully convinced you that here in our field, research informs practice, practice informs research. Our clinical questions are addressed with the same rigor and methodology that our research questions are addressed, and that our research questions are designed to have clinical utility. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you so much for your time here today. I would also like to acknowledge my mentors, colleagues, and students at the University of Florida, the University of Kansas, Aurora University, and Emirates College for Advanced Education, who made all of this work possible. Now, if you have any questions or discussion points, I would be happy to address them in the chat. Alternatively, you are welcome to email me. My email address is up there. QR code for references, again, is up there. And up next, we have a presentation by Dr. Clodagh Murray, one of my colleagues at ECAE, talking about restricted and repetitive behaviors in autism spectrum disorder, which certainly will be informative and a great follow-up to the topics already discussed here today. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jaspers, for an informative talk, and it's always good to see the science behind the practice. So thank you very much for a really informative talk. Our last speaker for the session is Dr. Clodagh Murray. Dr. Murray is a board-certified behavioral analyst at the doctoral level. She earned her PhD in applied behavioral analysis from the National University of Ireland. Sorry, I have two devices going. Dr. Murray is currently assistant professor at the Emirates College of Advanced Education, where she works on the only master's program in ABA in the UAE. Dr. Murray has extensive clinical experience, having worked with children and adults with and without neurodevelopmental disabilities, and her research focuses on developing strategies in promoting variability and flexibility in play and language in individuals with autism spectrum disorders. Over to you, Dr. Murray.
Hello everybody, I hope you're having a great conference so far. I'm Dr. Clodagh Murray and I'm an assistant professor at Emirates College for Advanced Education. I'm also a board certified behaviour analyst at the doctoral level. So I'd like to start by thanking my colleagues Dr. Michelle and Dr. Sarah for their excellent presentations, and I'd also like to thank you for giving us your time this evening. So my talk is about restricted and repetitive behaviors in autism spectrum disorder. And I'm hoping to raise a few questions actually, and have us all look at how we think about restricted and repetitive behaviors. And I'll talk a little bit about intervention towards the end. So let's do a little refresher. I'm sure you're all familiar with the DSM-5 diagnostic criteria for autism. So section A, of course, is concerned with social and communication deficits. And section B is concerned with restrictive and repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activities. So at least 2 of the following must be present for diagnosis. So the first category is stereotyped or repetitive motor movement. So that can be in speech or in how they use toys or just in how people use their bodies. Things like hand flapping can come in here, or echolalia, very repetitive speech. The next category is around the insistence on sameness, and this can manifest in things like, only being able to take one route to school. So the day that there's traffic or that there's roadworks, it's very difficult for that person to take a different route. Rituals and this kind of rigidity that we see in autism comes under this category. Next are the restricted interests. So, these can be sometimes very random. Of course, we all know children with autism who love trains, but these restricted interests, or sometimes called circumscribed interests, mean that they tend to perseverate on one topic or really not have an array of interests. So there's invariance in the interests that people have. And then this is a new category for DSM-5, which is hyper or hyporeactivity to sensory input. Now, this can manifest, the reason this is under the category of restricted and repetitive behaviors is because there might be rigidity in terms of, like is the example here, excessive smelling or touching of objects. So here the R or Bs are all around sensory input. So they might be oversensitive or undersensitive to different sensory stimulation, different types of sensory stimulation. So these categories of restricted repetitive behaviors beyond the DSM, many authors have been talking about them and trying to categorize and correlate different types of behaviors with different constructs like IQ. And so, in general, in the literature, we've seen this category of repetitive sensory motor behaviors. So this is the hand flapping, the rocking, a lot of gross motor movements here. Okay. The next category is insistence on sameness. And, many authors note that this sort of repetitive sensory motor behaviors can happen in other disorders like Tourette's. The insistence on sameness seems to be quite specific to autism. That's not to say it's not seen outside of autism, but it tends to kind of characterize individuals with autism. And of course, it's one of the first things that we'll see when we think about sending people for diagnosis. So Lam and colleagues in 2008 did a massive factor analysis of the questions related to RRBs that were on the Autism Diagnostic Interview revised. They looked at these items, there were 10 items, and they looked at them for 361 children. And they proposed this 3-factor solution where there was the repetitive sensory motor behaviors, insistence on sameness, and then also adding in circumscribed interests, which had been kind of characterized as this insistence on sameness. But Lam and colleagues found that it was actually quite a different construct. And that makes sense. The insistence on sameness is like everything has to be ordered and the same every day. I do my routines in a particular order, etc. And the circumcised interest is really where they're perseverating on one topic or really only having interest in a very small number of areas. And so Lam, in that same study, noticed that these repetitive sensory motor behaviors were more prevalent in younger participants or those with lower IQ and then greater social and communication deficits. So some authors have called this type of behaviors lower order stereotypies or lower order restricted repetitive behaviors, and the insistence on sameness and circumscribed interest were seen as kind of higher order and associated with greater functioning. And that is indeed what Lamb found for insistence on sameness. Although they did see that some people in this category had an even greater severity of autism, but not necessarily lower IQ. Then interestingly, circumscribed interest, this domain was not significantly related to IQ or any of the other symptom domains on the ADI. So in a more recent study, Brearley et al. Also looked at this factor structure of restricted repetitive behaviors. This article is currently in press actually, but they looked at these behaviors in children with autism and children with ADHD. And they looked at over 1,000 children for this study. So they came up with this 4-factor solution that was relevant for children with both diagnoses. So they talked about stereotypy, self-injury, compulsions, and ritualistic or sameness behavior. Now, self-injury is a really interesting one because Bodfish and colleagues who designed the repetitive behavior scale revised also highlight self-injury as its own category of restricted repetitive behaviors, and it's included with the more stereotypy restricted sensory motor behaviors and kind of described as lower order and generally associated with more significant impairment. They noted that the participants with autism had more severe or more prevalent restricted repetitive behaviors. They also noted that in the children with autism, IQ was negatively correlated with stereotypy and self-injury and compulsions. But in ADHD, it was different. It was negatively correlated with compulsions and the ritualistic sameness behaviors. So you can see that the factors are the same in autism and in ADHD, but the severity and the relationship with IQ differed. So I want to think now about the impact of restricted and repetitive behaviors on a person's life. So we know that interrupting somebody's very fixed routines can cause a lot of anxiety and distress. If a person is perseverated on one item or piece of clothing or very attached to it, then that can cause really big problems if something happens to that item. So if a child will only take their milk at night from this one sippy cup and the cup breaks or get lost, then maybe the child won't actually take their milk, then they won't go to sleep. It's very difficult. Can interfere with communication and learning. So if a person isn't able to, stop engaging in stereotypy for long enough to communicate their needs, or if they're very focused on their rituals or their repetitive motor movements, it's very difficult for them to focus, for example, on what a teacher is saying. Can be associated with a reluctance to try new things, and we want both children and adults to be open to trying new things because that's how you find out the things that you like. And then I've put this in italics because I want to discuss it slightly separately or in a different way, that we know that stereotypy interferes with social integration, but there are a lot of people who think that it's not the person with the stereotypy that should change, it's the people around them. So there's an argument to be made for us educating children, educating society. If someone is flapping their hands in the supermarket, that's fine. If they're engaging in stereotypy in the playground, that's fine. You can still play with them. They're still a person. They're still fun. So I think this movement away from there's something wrong with you if you're different is really positive. And I do think we need to look at how we can support people rather than having everyone be told they need to change just to fit in with what we want as a society. And that's exactly what Joyce et al. Did. They interviewed young adults with autism about their restricted repetitive behaviors. So these are not verbatim quotes, these are just the types of things that were said that I've summarized here. So they interviewed them, like I said. So people were saying that these behaviors make me feel calm or reduce anxiety, help me to focus, And then other people said, help me, they make them zone out so they can't focus. So again, this shows us we can't have a one size fits all. We have to really look at what's going on for the individual who's demonstrating these types of behaviors. Calms me when I'm angry, reduces hyperactivity. So someone else talked about that they have too much energy and this helps them to focus. And then many participants reported that they enjoyed it, that they actually liked engaging in stereotypy. It passed the time, it entertained them. However, a subgroup of those said they would actually rather be doing something else. So now that we've discussed this category of behaviors and their potential impact, both positive and negative on people with autism, I want us to see, can we look at these behaviors in a slightly different way? So if we were to think about restrictive repetitive behaviors as invariant or having low variability or being low in flexibility, then what this means is maybe we can look at ways to increase variability or to increase flexibility. And it seems like this will be a bit more positive than trying to decrease something that's happening at a high rate. So bear with me while I talk about this for a few minutes. So back in 1992, Professor Simon Baron-Cohen was interested in looking at deception in autism, right? So he was like, well, can they, try to trick you, or what will they do? So he used this really common game called the penny hiding game, and it's commonly used between in parent-child or adult-child interactions. So you take a penny and or a dirham, and you have it in one hand, and you hide your hands behind your back, and you say, which hand? Pick a hand, okay? So people play this with children all the time, and it's great fun, and they're trying to guess, and you have to try and behave unpredictably, right? In order so that the child won't guess where the penny is. So what he did was he had the experimenters play this game with children with autism and without autism, and a group with intellectual disability. So what he found was the children with autism just generated these really predictable patterns. So they would select the same hand every single time, even if it wasn't there a lot of the time. Or they would go right, left, right, left, right, left. And what happened with this study was, even though he wasn't looking to do this initially, it became like a proxy for measuring this invariant or repetitive type behavior. So they were researchers coming afterwards that were looking at variability in behavior were saying, well, they're inflexible. If they're going right, left, right, left, right, left, that's low variability, okay? They're not trying different things. They're not being spontaneous or random. So this, I replicated this study, but I used it in a slightly different way. I was looking at this as a measure of variability in responding, okay? So we had, just very briefly, there were actually 4 phases. So in the first 3, the experimenters hiding the penny. Sometimes we used little plastic toys. We didn't want children to swallow the penny. So we just checked that they actually wanted it and would care about finding it before we decided on the toy. So it did vary across participants, which could be a confounding variable. So the first couple of trials was the no-lose condition. So this language is coming from the original Baron-Cohen study, but that is basically a fixed ratio schedule of 1. So every time you select a hand, you pay out. So in reality, you've got 2 things in your hands, right? So whichever one they pick, you're going to say, oh, you found it. Then the no win, which is you lose all the time, which is extinction. So there's actually nothing in your hand. You just slip it in your back pocket. And so every time they select a hand, oh, it's not there. Oh, try again. And then in the last section, you're actually trying. You're trying to be unpredictable. So they'll get it sometimes here, okay? Then in the next section, the child hides the penny. And then we look at whether they can generate sort of different patterns in that section. Then we, defined like repeating, switching, or an irregular strategy. And from here, we had 10 different behavior patterns from the least to the most variable. So we can see here, this is the autism group. And you can see over here, number 1 is the lowest variability. And we've got, 9 participants there. They're mainly bunched around the middle, and very few are getting highest variability pattern. But then the neurotypical children, none of them have these really repetitive patterns, and lots of them have the most variable patterns. So we can see the difference. So what this might actually mean is that if you're not trying new things, you're not finding out where the good stuff is. And so Mullins and Reinkover in '85 were looking at associating different card selections with different rates of paying out. Okay, so on one of the cards would deliver the edible reinforcer every time you selected it. One of them you had to select it 11 times for it to actually deliver the reinforcer. And so the neurotypical children tried them all, found the good ones, stayed on that. The children with autism didn't sample all of them, and most did not locate the optimum schedule, and some actually only tried one and stuck on that for like 100 selections. So this is a proxy again, but it's showing us that if you're not trying different things in the environment due to your rigidity, you're not finding out where the reinforcers are, you're not finding out where the good stuff is. And so Rodriguez and Thompson wrote a really excellent paper where they called Behavioral Variability in Autism Spectrum Disorder, and they were making this case very strongly for this type of behavior as a problem of invariance. And they talked about it impacting on problem solving, social interactions, play. So if you can't try different things, it's hard to solve problems. It's hard to have interesting and functional play, and it's hard to develop a broad language repertoire. And so the implications for intervention here are actually really massive. So in the past, the focus has been on getting rid of things that we don't want, especially all these motor stereotypies. It was like, you can't do that in class, you know? And again, that can be quite stressful for the individual trying to keep a lid on it when it's difficult for them to do so. But instead, what we want to do now is we want to look at how we can diversify the number of response topographies. So can we actually teach them to do lots of different things, lots of different motor movements, even through dance, through play? Can we do lots of different actions with the toys, not just the same repetitive ones all the time? With circumscribed interest, can we increase the number of interests? For insistence on sameness, can we give reinforcement every time they try something different? Can we teach multiple routines rather than just one rigid routine? And we can do this through reinforcement. There's lots of 50 years of research on this in the basic animal literature and behavior analysis. And in the last 10 years or so, we've been bringing this out of the lab and seeing how we can use this information to look at real world problems. And one thing that we can do is directly deliver reinforcement contingent on varied responding. And we can start this from a really young age. So every time a child tries a new toy, if we've got a bit of a rigid child, every time they even pick up a new toy, we're giving lots of reinforcement, high fives, tickles, blowing bubbles, giving edible reinforcement, whatever it takes. We can also provide reinforcement every time they do something new. So every time we see a new movement we haven't seen before, we're jumping straight in and giving lots of reinforcement. Now we can formalize that and provide reinforcement contingent on responses that vary from the preceding 2 or 3 responses, for example, and this is called a lag schedule. Now, if you're interested in lag schedules, feel free to contact me and I will give you any information that you need. And I have some reinforcers or I have some references on my final slide. However, for now, what you could take away is that we just want to reinforce behaviors that are different, that are new. But let me show you some data about lag schedules just in case you're interested. So this is one of my PhD studies, and you can see just a kind of a regular toy table trying to appeal to a broad range of children. And what I did was I delivered reinforcement just in the form of tokens that they then swapped for edibles and iPads and things like that. And they received a token every time they did an action with the toy that differed from the previous one. And then I moved to what's called a lag 2 schedule, and now the action has to differ from the previous 2 to get reinforcement. So you see we're building it up and getting more varied responding. Now we did get an increase in variability in the actions with toys, but Look at the stereotypy. One participant, you see really high at baseline. All he's doing is tapping the toys off the table, off the wall. Very repetitive, very high rate stereotypy here. And you can see as soon as we get the intervention going, that goes right down. Same in lag 2, and then a tiny increase during a post-intervention probe. That was 1 week later. So we're seeing that when he's engaging with the toys, at least, this participant's stereotypy is going way down. Same pattern for participant 2, though you can see the frequency is nowhere near as high. Yeah, you can see then actually in the follow-up probe, there's no stereotypy. And the third participant, similar pattern, only one baseline probe here for this participant, but it was up near 40. And then, you know, a bit variable across the first condition, nice and low across the second, and relatively low in the probe session as well. Now, of course, if you're playing with toys more, you're less likely to engage in the stereotypy. But what we shifted is what they're doing with the toys. So at baseline, they see these lovely toys, all they're doing is engaging in stereotypy either with or without the toys. During intervention, we reinforce different and varied actions with the toys. Sometimes we have to give some prompts to guide them, but we select out through reinforcement. And what we see is, as appropriate and varied play increases, stereotypy decreases. So this gives us a really nice direction for future research in this area. The final thing I want to say about intervention is just our aim is not cessation. It's not that to stop these behaviors, it's to teach people to self-manage. So one other really good way to do this is to identify times of the day or locations where the person can engage. So even if they're in school, for example, maybe set a timer for 5 minutes, then they can go to a play corner, engage in stereotypy and come back. The important thing is that you can use some kind of a cue, a timer or a stimulus card to identify the time or indeed the location. Sometimes people put masking tape around the floor. You can engage here, but not over here, okay? We provide reinforcement and support for you. Well done, your whatever language you want to use. Well done, you're listening well. Okay, now you're like, oh, look, you're doing your movements over here. That's fine. You can have whatever. You can say fun hands or fun time or whatever. You can say, oh, you're doing it here. That's great. This is where you're supposed to do it. And then always provide a way for the person to request time to engage, so that if it's getting difficult for them to control it, that they can go to their location and engage in as they need to, and then come back and be able to focus and listen and learn. So I'd like to thank you most sincerely for your time and your attention this evening. And from my colleagues and I, that's Dr. Michelle, Dr. Sarah, and I'm Dr. Clodagh. Thank you again, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
So thank you all very much for such a wonderful treat to and a comprehensive overview of understanding challenging behavior, getting an understanding of formulation and functional analysis, some of the research to functional analysis, and certainly making sense of restrictive repetitive behavior. So thank you all very much for that. It also shows a passion and dedication that we're all here at 8 p.m. Sort of to talk about this. We haven't had any questions come in so far, but I thought I'd have almost an opening discussion about almost in day-to-day clinical practice. Often, certainly in our service, we would get families coming in with a whole variety of challenging behavior. And I really like the acronym because it makes it easy to remember the STEAM one, whether it's sensory, tangible, and so on. So, I guess what is the, from your practice, what are some of the day-to-day clinical practice challenges that you will find in the parents, I would say, because often working with the children with difficulties, we, all the work and the discussions you've given have been really enlightening. It's almost a question for what is it that parents can do in between or to assist some of that work to ensure better outcomes for their sons and daughters.
Sure, I'll get us started here and then see what else we have. So a very important part of behavior analytic intervention is that, I spoke to this a bit in my presentation, that we may identify preferred reinforcers or functions for challenging behavior. And we can even, we can work with that child or that individual, teach better ways to request the items, teach patience and all that good stuff. But they also need to be returning to an environment in which those responses are being reinforced. So it truly is a parent, parents, caregivers, siblings, teachers, everyone who's in that one individual's environment has to be part of that and kind of be on board with, if they're making this request, it's imperative at this point in their life that if they're requesting your attention, we've got to stop what you're doing. We got to put down the phone. We got to stop making dinner, whatever it is that's happening to deliver that attention at that moment. Obviously, that's not real life forever. So that's not going to be the intervention that goes on long term. But to at least get challenging behavior reduced in the start, we need parents and caregivers to be responsive to those more appropriate behaviors. Then we can, fade how often they'll be making those requests and work on other target behaviors. But making sure as a clinician that everyone is on the same page in terms of how to respond to appropriate behavior and how to respond to challenging behavior. The other point I would make before I'll turn it over to my colleagues is just to say that we need to be realistic as clinicians of what we're asking of parents and families. So, if I go in and develop an intervention that may work very well at a school environment where they have one-on-one support, now they go home, they're one child of 5 and lots of other, competing requirements for the parents. So I think the onus is on us as clinicians to make sure that the intervention that we're putting in place before we say go, the parents confirm with us that they're able to fully implement that program as we've suggested. I'll pause there. It looks like Dr. Michelle might be able to follow up next.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Sarah, for that. And thank you to Dr. Khalid for this excellent question. And I think just to follow up on what Dr. Sarah was talking about and what Professor Tammy was talking about, that we do see an increase in problem behaviors in the home, especially now during this lockdown. So to come back to your question of what can parents do now and, what can they take away from our talks and use, in their home tomorrow with their children. And coming back to that STEAM, which can help us, it's really important for us to try our best as parents, and I'm a mama, but it's up to us to try our best to not reinforce problem behaviors, because of course if we are giving reinforcement to these problem behaviors, they're going to keep happening and they might even get worse. So if we can do a brief analysis and just check out what do we think is the reinforcing variable, is it that the child is likely engaging in this tantrum to get our attention, then what can we do as a parent? If we don't deliver that attention, then ultimately, if the behavior is not being reinforced, we're going to see a decrease in that behavior. Because if they figure out, okay, if I engage in this tantrum behavior and I'm not getting what I want out of it, they'll ultimately stop doing that behavior. And as Dr. Sarah said, it's obviously very important that when they are engaging in appropriate behaviors, that we give them lots of attention for that. So really making sure that we're delivering the reinforcer as parents when our kids are engaging in appropriate behaviors rather when they're engaging in the problem behaviors. And what we say in our world is catch them being good. You know, it's really important to catch them in that moment of when they are engaging in those good behaviors and really delivering lots of reinforcers so that we see more of them in the future. So again, looking at STEAM, looking at which of these variables is it that is reinforcing these behaviors.
Yeah, and thank you both very much. I mean, certainly we've seen a shift in behavior in the.
Hi, thank you so much to my colleagues. I'll just jump in on that question with my perspective based on the topic I was discussing. And what I would really like to see parents being empowered to do is, yes, catch them being good. That's really important. But I would say catch them being variable or flexible. So anytime we see children trying new things, or adults, of course, anytime we see engagement in a new activity, we'd like to give that a lot of encouragement and reinforcement. And the next thing I would encourage is maybe to try not to feed into these very inflexible routines. And I say that again, like Dr. Sarah, trying to understand the difficulty of sometimes dealing with this insistence on sameness, and it can cause some distress when we interrupt the routines. However, if we can just interrupt them in very small ways and not, you know, structure our morning in the same way every day, can we try new things every now and then reinforce, you know, the child being able to go along with that. Oh, look, we tried something different today. Oh, we're trying a new bowl, like very small things. But if you do the same thing every day to avoid your child being distressed, you know, what you're doing is you're setting them up for them not being able to cope when things change later on, when you're not able to control everything in their world. So just start during play, start just mixing things up in a really small way. And these are like really small things that parents can do that we believe can make a really big difference.
You're absolutely right, and I was wondering if we've certainly in our services seen a bit of a shift from historically what used to be a behavior from parents where they would sort of bring the young people to experts and therapists and say, well, sort of, you know, do what you do. And now that in the context of COVID, where they're having to spend quite a lot of time, certainly in the last 6 months with the children at home, I think, if anything, if I may use the term, it's a, you know, silver lining that families have been able to spend a bit more time getting to know their children and getting to know their areas of strength and there's some of the challenges that might have been hidden historically. And now they're presenting, saying, what is it that we can do to manage in the day-to-day? So I think that shift has been, I think, a positive shift, or can only be a positive shift in the relationship between the parents and the children. The other thing that we notice sometimes is often the challenging behavior or the problem behavior hasn't really escalated in any way. It's sort of remained the same. But what's happened is, because of the stress and the pressure that parents are under, it's their ability to manage that has reduced, which has meant that the problem behavior seems to have escalated. And often we will work, or I don't know if you would have insights in how we support the parents to, in essence, look after themselves, to be able to look after the children.
Sure, I'll get us started first again.
Yeah.
So yes, and I think what you're speaking to is that you know, the capacities that parents have to be doing all the things they need to be doing right now, right? They're trying to take care of their own jobs. They're trying to be teachers at home and also parents at home and all of these things. And then when challenging behavior starts to occur, you know, they know what the intervention plan is. They know, okay, I need to ignore this. The tantrum's going to happen. But there are times when you just can't let it happen because for whatever reason, you're in the grocery store, you got to get out of there, you know you're going to reinforce it, it's going to happen. So number one, I would say just grace and forgiveness to yourself on those. Almost label it, well, I just reinforced that. Okay, how do I move on? And not let that ruin the whole day. Recognize that there are times when problem behavior is going to be reinforced, and then go back to what Dr. Michelle was talking on earlier about, trying to deliver those potential reinforcers that catch them being good ahead of time. So when problem behavior and challenging behavior is occurring, that can often feel like a crisis to family, and we don't want them to get to that point. So if we can help families set up schedules of attention, schedules of taking breaks from school, those types of things, be very proactive. Hopefully we can avoid getting to the point. And then of course, making sure that, the services are there for parents as well in terms of their own mental health and self-care during these times. Do they have someone that, if they're giving their all to help their children through these trying times, who are they then going to rely on? So I'd say those 3 points would be my response to that question.
Yeah, and just to follow up, thank you, Dr. Sarah. There is certainly a silver lining. I absolutely agree with you, Dr. Khaled. Silver lining to COVID, and that we are getting to spend a lot more face-to-face time with our kids. But with that, of course, a lot of challenges. As Dr. Sarah said, we're wearing a lot of different hats. I'm wearing my behavior analyst hat, I'm wearing my academic hat, I'm wearing my teacher hat, I'm wearing my mama hat, and there's just a lot of hats. There's a lot of juggling for each of us, and it's difficult. I think one extra aspect that Dr. Sarah, just to add on to what Dr. Sarah said, is the importance of nannies right now as well, and in terms of not just empowering parents, but making it consistent across everyone that has day-to-day access with their kids. So empowering nannies as well to help engage and make sure that mama and baba and tata and everyone in the house is consistent and is in on this, and that everyone knows when we're trying to catch them being good, when we shouldn't be delivering attention to certain behaviors. And I think it's really important to have that consistency across everyone that the child is interacting with, especially during these trying times when there's so much change, which of course can be very challenging for individuals on the autism spectrum. Dr. Clodagh, do you have anything to add?
Thank you for that. I think my colleagues have covered this question really comprehensively. But just to the silver lining point, that it's great that parents are seeing a bit more of their children, but I think we need to do whatever we can to provide additional support to parents during this time. And parents who are lucky enough right now to have in-home support are learning a huge amount from observing therapists. And, it would be great if more families can get this support. So I think we need to do what we can to ensure that all families have access to that kind of support, and then they can, learn from those therapists. I think a lot of parents are being really empowered right now, and I think we should try and look at how we can spread that around as much as possible.
Excellent. And so to one last question, if I may, you were mentioning, Dr. Kelly, you're wearing several different hats, and as all of our esteemed speakers today, of sort of a clinical hat, an academic hat, a teacher hat, and you're obviously all at the Emirates College of Advanced Education, quite intrigued by the masters, because that's a relevant, almost the training and education bit, that the master's degree in ABA, which is the only one that runs in the UAE. For anyone who's interested in the audience or the attendees, I don't know if you wanted to tell us a bit more about what that program entails, and if people are interested, what they need to do.
Sure, thank you for that question, Dr. Khaled. So as you correctly mentioned, all three of us are faculty within the Applied Behaviour Analysis, or ABA program. So we currently offer 2 different graduate programs in Applied Behaviour Analysis. So we have, as I mentioned at the start of my talk, a 1-year postgraduate diploma in ABA. And here you learn, the foundations, the principles, the concepts of ABA, ethics of implementing these interventions. specific, there's an entire course dedicated to behavior change procedures, so learning evidence-based strategies. And of course, there's also a course dedicated to assessment of behavior, just like...
Sorry, I think there's a bit of distortion in your mic. It's better now.
Okay, I apologize. Can you hear me clearer now?
Much better.
Oh, I apologize for that. So I was just outlining the different courses that were you would expect to study if you were interested in completing a postgraduate diploma. So you would learn such things as how to assess problem behaviors, the ethics involved, and then learning practical strategies of how to increase and see more positive behaviors, appropriate behaviors, and also about behavior reduction. So dealing with those problem behaviors that we spoke about in our sessions. Then we have a 2-year Masters of Education in Applied Behavior Analysis, which extends beyond that and looks at more advanced topics in applied behavior analysis. And as you quite rightly said, Dr. Khaled, Emirates College for Advanced Education, or ECAE, is the only institution in the UAE that currently offers graduate training in ABA. And we also complete the coursework requirement for the BACD certification, so for the board certification exam. So if anyone is interested, I did provide my email, so hopefully you're able to note that. I'm sure we can share that as well. If anyone is interested, you are most welcome to contact me. We have 2 campuses, so we have a campus in Abu Dhabi and we also have a campus in Ajman.
Excellent. There has actually, thank you very much, Michelle. There's a question that came in and I'm just going to read it out. So the question is, I'm curious to know whether there's any form of dietary interventions or dietary research for particular characteristics and behaviors associated with ASD in the work. So dealing with potential GI issues, but also with behavioral issues. So that's the first question. And the second one is, what number of sessions would one need to improve patient behavior, the young people's behavior? So the first one's about diet, food and sort of the role of dietary interventions in the management of challenging behavior in ASD, with the theories about GI, and then the other one's about how many sessions would they need.
All right, I think it's getting thrown to me again. So I'll start us off, but then hopefully other people will come in with their responses as well. Yes, so a very important part of what we do as behavior analysts is work interdisciplinarily. So I am not an expert on, GI interventions or other comorbid medical diagnoses, but a very important part of what we do, you heard it in STEAM, is making sure that we're working with the appropriate people who have that. So yes, there are times when there are physiological components, whether it's sleep or it's GI, it's diet related, seizure disorders. There are a lot of times where medical diagnoses and medical conditions are interfering and interacting with behavior. So it becomes, again, the onus is on us as clinicians to make sure that we're working with the proper medical doctors to be doing that. So I cannot speak to that research. It's not my area of expertise, but there are certainly, especially many of the inpatient behavior analytic programs around the world. So thinking of Kennedy Krieger Institute at the Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland in the US, the University of Nebraska Medical Center in Omaha, Nebraska in the US. They both have massive kind of medical and feeding programs. So those are great programs to look at if people are interested in kind of that interaction between behavior and medical. And then in terms of kind of the dosage is sometimes the term that we use in terms of how much ABA do we need to see that. I think that Dr. Clodo would be a great person to follow up on that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sarah, and thanks for that really thoughtful answer to that first question too. Just in terms of dosage or treatment intensity, there's lots of different ways to describe that, and really you know, you can't answer because the interventions are so individualized. But what we would be recommending is to assess behavior initially and to measure the rates of behavior consistently throughout the course of the intervention, and then be guided by the data. Now, I know it's easier if we could say, like sometimes a physiotherapist can say, oh, 3 sessions and I'll fix your back. You know, sometimes we can see, you know, we know that we can probably make quite quick improvements, but really we're guided by the data all the time and keeping an eye closely on how successful we're being. Sometimes we need to make changes to our interventions. So what we try to do is have as much impact as we can, you know, in as brief time as possible, so we can be really efficient in our work, but always being guided by what the individual is telling us with their behavior. I say maybe some of my colleagues might follow up on this.
Yeah, just for you know, the people in attendance this evening, thank you again for joining us so late. One thing I would just recommend, sorry, I'm getting feedback, is that if anyone in our audience is, thank you, Dr. Kota. Okay, if there's anyone in our audience who is interested, perhaps one of their clients, they think that applied behavior analysis intervention is a way to go for any of their clients, you know, how do you access ABA services within the UAE? Again, you know, my top tip for this would be to look at those who are running the programs. You know, the gold standard in our field is to look for someone that is a BCBA, a board certified behavior analyst. So it's really important, you know, there are, you know, potentially, and this is around the world, there are centers that are, you know, claiming to be offering ABA, but don't necessarily have the skills and the training and the experience. But to become a board certified behavior analyst, BCBA, you go through the training, you go through the coursework, you get supervised clinical experience. And as I said, we do see this as the gold standard. So what I would say is anyone in the UAE who is seeking intervention, to just make sure that those on staff, you know, there is a BCBA designing the programs. Again, please feel free to email me if you are looking for specific centres that have individuals on staff with that credential.
Excellent. Thank you all very much for such a comprehensive and a treat really for, you know, for certainly for clinicians and parents and therapists out there who see, and I'm sure struggle on a day-to-day basis with managing challenging behavior in the context of children with ASD. It's quite a fascinating and complex field. So thank you all very much for your insights and for your sharing your knowledge and your generosity with your time. If there are no other questions, I think I will bring the session to a close, and I look forward to seeing you all in person, hopefully very soon. Thank you all so very much.
Inshallah. Thank you.
Thank you.